I've been trying to figure this out for a couple of days, how I'm going to do this. Yeah. I wasn't sure, and then I started to think about it, and so last night I was trying to figure out that, just what is the best way to get in front of you and not fall over. Because I've decided that enough is enough already. Some of you would maybe remember what the last message I gave to you, what the words were. Anybody? If this is as bad as it gets, it's okay. Well, over the last 30 days, I've had this. Thank you, Mike. This is going to be much safer. Wait, are you going to be next? You need the cart? So, over the last 30 days, I've been fortunate enough. I'm going to say fortunate enough because you got to have a sense of humor about this stuff. I've been fortunate enough to have a toe amputated, a debilitating cough that has kept me from doing just about anything outside of the house. And yet, through all of that, all I really wanted to do was get back here. You got to know that my heartbeat, my passion is right here. And against medical advice, against the advice of my wife, and at times every single one of the staff members, I continue to show up because that's just who I am. I've heard it said my whole life that whenever you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. And then this week in preparation, I came across a quote that's similar to it, and it says, when you come to the end of your rope, remember that God's on the other end. And I got to tell you the truth that for much of the last month, it felt like God definitely had the other end of the rope, but he was shaking it. I wanted to just see how hard I would hold on. And sometimes it's like that. There's tests. And what I've seen to be true, what I know to be true, is that whenever there's a big test, you know what the teacher does, right? The teacher gets real silent. The teacher doesn't have any help for you during the test. And over the last month, I've had periods where God has just kind of left me alone and allowed me to contemplate and think and reevaluate a lot of different things. And during this time, I've seen God be bigger than I thought he was going to be. And I have a pretty big imagination. If you don't think so, sign up to be at the board meetings. I got a pretty big imagination. But God has proven during this last month to be bigger than that, further than that, larger than that. That during this time, I've been making a comparison, if you will. And it's the reason that I've been focused on this message today. See, Pastor Mike wanted me to wait one more week till I could actually walk. And it's good advice. I just happen to not listen to it. And that's not his fault. So if anybody wants to give him a hard time about not taking another week, he tried. And I just couldn't let this message go. And I think that you'll pick up on it if you'll follow along with me. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 1. This is not a real often preached message. And since I have a limited voice here, I'm not going to read the chapter to you. Instead, I'm going to point you to the screen, and we'll get it that way, I think.
Now it came to pass, in the days when the judges ruled, that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Kilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Kilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and had 2 daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law,
Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead, and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband.
So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept.
Surely we will return with you to your people. Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters. For it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me.
Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. But Ruth clung to her.
Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me.
When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Now the 2 of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened, when they had come to Bethlehem, that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said,
Is this Naomi? Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?
So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest.
If you've not read this story, you're probably going to miss some finer details. One of them that really just jumps out at me is, man, could much more have happened to this woman? And every time I ask that question, I can't help but say, oh yeah, much more. Much more could have happened. I don't believe in jinxing things or saying the wrong thing or, what have you. But I do understand that when you start to speak things into your life, you begin to prepare as though they're going to happen. And you're waiting for them to happen. All throughout, all the different things that have happened to this woman, she is fairly confident in one thing. That if she can get back to her people and her God, everything's going to be all right. And I think that if we can grab a hold of that, we catch the giant narrative of this message, that there's hope, but it's not in what I can do. It's not in what you can do, but it's in running back to our God. That if we can get to the point where we can place our faith so strongly and so squarely in what God is doing, even in the midst of what it feels like is going on. And things are happening, no doubt. Things are happening. Things are always happening. It's part of the human experience. But that doesn't mean that it has to be something that destroys us or breaks us to the point of not being able to recover. One of the best parts of being in the hospital for a week was that I got to meet a lot of people that I would have never met. And having those opportunities to be able to share that my faith wasn't in the surgeon. I was going to trust the surgeon to do his job. And my faith wasn't in the nurses, but I was trusting the nurses to do their job. My faith was in God, who placed those people in the path of what was going on. And what I found out since is that when I've had an opportunity to go back twice now and visit with the nursing team that was able to help me. And several of them say, we're just amazed that you're upright and happy and that you've recovered so fast. I think that they expected that giving me one of these carts would mean that I'd be back real soon, with something broken and I tried to crash this thing as hard as I could, and it can be dangerous. So the reality of life is that we're all going to face the chances and the choices of life. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Much of life hinges on circumstances. Things happen. Trees fall. Sometimes they land on a house, and sometimes they land between the house. But either way, there's cleanup that has to be done. In the story that we just listened to, there's a famine that comes across the land. And Elimelech had no control over a famine. But nonetheless, famine came and people starved. Now there's an option. You can see that famine has arrived and you can get up and you can leave. But famine doesn't just come to your city. Famine tends to come to your state, to your country, to the surrounding area. There's reason to believe that you can't outrun famine. Once it starts, crops die, cattle die. There's nothing you can do. You're surviving on whatever's left. So that's chance. The death of the two sons. One of them was rather sickly and died. That happens. People die. We understand that, right? Just making sure I still got you. Yes, people just die. It happens. They get sick, they die. A famine, when you're a sickly person, is not going to help. But that had nothing to do with the choice of life. One of the boys in study, it says that he was just failing. He was failed at everything, and it's not really all that surprising that he would fail at living as well. That's highly critical. You just got to follow along with me there. And then the second part of that, with a hinge, is that much of life is about deliberate choices. We actively choose things. A few weeks ago, we talked about when we make choices, we pick our results. And this is where we get in the most trouble. This is where we have no choice but to look in the mirror and say, that's where the problem is. That person right there not making good decisions. And much of our life depends on the choices that we make. Much less of our life is about the chances that we run into. See, they chose to live or to leave Bethlehem and live in Moab. And knowing that there was famine and knowing that the dad and the two boys, that they died, you might look back and go, well, moving to Moab was probably the worst part. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was that they were following the gods of Moab. The gods of Moab required human sacrifice. It's hard to come back from that. But once you start sacrificing people to a false god, it's hard to come back from that. And you may remember from earlier studies that we serve what can only be classified as a jealous God. What do you think is going to happen when you begin to serve a God that requires sacrifice of his people? This human sacrifice, probably the part where they made the worst choice. Because moving to that land means that they made a bad choice. You see that over and over again throughout the Bible where choices dictate results. And then as humanity, I'm not picking on this group of people because I know it doesn't apply to all of us, but humanity as a whole wants to blame somebody. And we look around and we go, well, it's not my fault. It couldn't possibly be me that's the problem here. And we want to believe that first. It happens all the way back to the very first sin. The first thing that Adam does confronted with sin is, well, it's that woman that you gave me. He blames Eve and God for sin that he committed. That's somehow deep inside of us that we don't want to believe anything is our fault. If we go all the way back and we look at the book of Judges, if you're a note taker, go back and read chapter 3, and you'll see the way the Moabs treated Israel. So it's normal for us to celebrate our good choices. It's just as normal for us to regret our bad ones. I think that as a general rule, that most people that I talk to, the regret of bad choices or choices not made is stronger than the celebration of good choices. When you have a conversation with someone and they can't remember anything nothing's been good. Nothing's been good. You kind of got to backtrack that. It's mathematically impossible for nothing to be good. But we focus on the bad. We focus on the negative. And we get locked in there that we begin to regret. And regret leads us to make choices that we wouldn't normally make. And those choices give us more to regret. So we have to come to a point where we start with the choices. And start there, that we would look back, yes, and see the choices of our past, but looking forward to make better choices for the future. Because what we do today is paid for in the future. Our past doesn't pay the price. That's done and over with. But our future pays the price for everything we choose to do today. Now, regardless of our past, we can make good choices about our future. This is where we tend to get bogged down. We say, well, I'm in this place because of what I did 30 years, 40 years ago. And that may be true, but you'll stay in that place forever if you allow that kind of decision making to hold you in that place. We all have an opportunity to let go of our past, to celebrate the change that God has made in us. But the only way we get there is if we will actually allow God to make those changes in us and through us. By focusing on what His Word says, we can get to that place where we're making the decisions with Him instead of on our own. I can tell you, every problem I've ever been in, it's because I made the decision all by myself. Every single one. Anytime I've ever had a result that I didn't appreciate, I can look back at something that I said or did when I shouldn't have said or done whatever it was. All right, I just gave you a big admission of guilt. It's always been my fault. Every time. I'm not looking for somebody to blame. I've already found that person. It's me. And I think that if you would do the same thing with yourself, you'd come to the same conclusion. That no matter where it is that you wanted to go or wish you had gone, if you didn't get or it didn't happen, it was on you. That's tough teaching. I got my own toes in on that. These are words I didn't plan to say. Naomi chose to return to Bethlehem. Now, in part, she was going back to her people, back to her God. But also, she was running from her poor decisions. There was nothing left for her in Moab except their God, their way, and two girls. Now, I would imagine that Naomi, every time she looked at those two girls, all she could see was her two boys. And she would have liked nothing better than to leave those girls behind, go back to her homeland, and try to salvage a life. But that's where the story kind of takes a turn. Because after the famine was over, and even though she desired to be with her own people, she chose to release her daughters-in-law. She told them to go back to their own family. Now, I'm pretty certain that I've shared this with you in the past, but just in case you've never heard it, these girls, they were in the worst possible situation. They had no children, no husband, and no brothers-in-law. The reason that's important is in that time, it was customary for when a husband died, his brother would marry the wife. And the firstborn son would be the dead brother's child. Go ahead, wrap your head around it. I'm struggling to say it, and I studied it. So that was their way of carrying on the family line. Well, there's no brothers here. There's no one to rely on. We heard it in the passage. Naomi begs these girls to go back to their families because even if she had someone who would marry her, and even if she had enough life in her to give another child or two, it would be ballpark 20 years before these girls have a husband again. Well, you know, I imagine that you know, the life expectancy doesn't really call for this to be a workable solution. And, I mean, just be kind of blunt, not many 18 to 20-year-olds that are looking for 45 or 50-year-old women to be their life-giving family. That's rough. And so she sends these girls away. But Naomi, she regarded her circumstances in light of God's providence. Instead of looking at the situation and saying, everything is bad, everything is terrible, she looked as though things were still possible. This is the motivating factor for going back to her family, back to Bethlehem, back to God. Now, it says in the passage that she changed her name to Mara, which means bitter. Not that she was bitter, but that God had dealt with her bitterly. We don't have any evidence that Naomi ever was bitter. Instead, we have evidence that proves that she was more like Job, that she praised God even though the circumstances were poor. Even though all this tragedy had been around her. I mean, I think it was probably pretty normal. I think any one of us might look around and go, okay, what have I done so wrong that there's not food and everybody I love is dead? But I think Naomi, like Job, like the beginning of this series, if this is as bad as it's going to get, that's okay. I'm okay. We have to take this thought process. See, Ruth chose to trust in Naomi's God. And this is tougher than it sounds. Because what Ruth was doing was rejecting her God. She was rejecting all the background that she had in Moab. She was rejecting her family. She was resisting the temptation to follow her sister-in-law. Because she was borrowing Naomi's faith. And there's nothing wrong with a borrowed faith, but it only gets you so far. I would put forward a thought today that all of us, at some point or another, maybe even today, are working with what I call a borrowed faith. You're borrowing it from your parents, from a close friend, from your pastor. That you're believing that God is strong enough to get you through whatever it is you're going through. But at the end of those battles, at the end of that simple salvation prayer, you have to have your own faith. And you got to be able to grab a hold and say, my God. It's not, Pastor Rebecca's God is going to get me through this. Ruth had to get to a point where it was no longer Naomi's God in Bethlehem. It was Ruth's God. That when she gathered around with the people in Bethlehem, it was no longer a borrowed faith. It was instead beginning point. She took Naomi's faith as a launch to say, if Naomi's faith is large enough to withstand all this tragedy, I want it. And that selfishness is the borrowed faith, the grabbing hold of something that we can't understand. But there has to be more. There has to be a conscious effort to grab a hold and hold on to God. Not just that knot in the end of the rope, but the God who holds the other end of the rope. That we're not just reaching for the rope anymore, we're reaching for the hand that holds the rope. By leaving Moab, Ruth became part of a royal line. She became part of the line of David. And with that, the line of Christ. Ruth gave up a lot. She left everything behind in Moab. But she gained a royal line. So I would say to you today that whatever it is you're holding on to, whatever it is the situation that we have claimed as the worst, this is the new phrase, that this is the worst. No matter what it is, that's the worst. Whatever it is that is in your life that is the worst, my hope is that you would understand that at your worst is when God does His best. That if you will allow Him to take the last chapter of your life and allow Him to hold it and allow Him the decision-making privileges, that life changes. That it doesn't just change into this moment where, God got me through that, God got me through this, but instead it becomes a reliance on Jesus Christ. To where you say, no matter what the decision is, whatever it is that Christ would have me do, that's what I want to do. That's where I want to be. See, every one of us in our chapters of our life, we have dark spots. Things happen. Sometimes by our choices, sometimes by our chances. Things happen. But God owns the last chapter of your life. And if we will just simply trust in Jesus, then our last chapter is full of life, full of hope, full of a dignity that doesn't exist here. When we know that we can rely on that last chapter being God's chapter, then we realize that our dark chapters don't matter. One of the hardest things to do is to forgive yourself after God has forgiven you. It's, in my opinion, it's the last part of forgiveness. Because we look back and we say, I did that, and I did this, and I messed this up, and I messed that up, and I've ruined my life. And God says, come to me. All of you who are weary, and I'll give you rest. What a great privilege that is, if we'll take it. That we can bring the worst of our life and lay it down as an offering to Jesus. And He takes it and He makes it what only He can do. Royal. See, I know that God has the solutions to whatever's going on in my life. I've not had a single doubt of that. But I also know there's been times where everything was running very, very smooth for me. And I was able to speak into people's lives when they were not having a smooth time. I think it's important that we not just celebrate the smooth, easy times, but that we also celebrate the rocky, rough times. So we would say, I don't know what you're teaching me, God, but I want to learn it. Hey, I've started to say, I want to learn it this time, God. I want to learn it this time so I don't have to do this again. Whatever it is, whoever it is you want me to talk to, Lord, let me learn it the first time. And then when the opportunity arises, I want the opportunity to be able to speak encouragement to others. Today I want to do what I would do if this was a teen group or a children's group. I want to give you a verse to memorize. If you're a note taker, I would say write this down. If you've got a Bible that you can highlight or write in, if you're not scared of such things. I know many of you were taught never ever make a mark in a Bible. But Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Congregation, if you've been called to His purpose, God is working out everything for your good. What a great encouragement that is. Oh man, I think it would be very easy for me to say the last 30 days has been the most challenging time of my life. But I've hung on to that. I know that He's working something out. Pastor Mike said I just needed to rest a little bit. That may be true. But what I know for certain is that God's working something out, and I'm cool with that. If that's what it takes, I'm cool with that. I'm all right. Whatever you're doing, I'm good. I've visited so many people in the hospital that say, why me? Why me? Why me? Why me? And if that's in your vocabulary, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce a different way. Why not me? Why not me? When I was in the corporate world, if people were chewing on me and giving me a hard time, I always said, well, that's good. I know they're leaving other people alone. I have kind of the same philosophy with whatever it is that God's doing. Why not me? Why not me? Maybe, just maybe, somebody else is getting left alone. And if I'm carrying somebody else's burden, well, I have His help. It's not so heavy. And it's giving somebody else a break. But to be able to say that, it requires that you believe that God has your best interest at heart. And if you believe that He has your best interest, then you have to trust Him. You have to be willing to say, yes, Lord. To go where He sends you, to say what He tells you to say, and to trust Him and do what He's called you to do. We have way too much of a price that's been paid for us. Forgiveness is available through the blood of Jesus. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter where you've been. Come to Jesus. He's ready and willing to change your life if you will allow it. If you can't hold on to that everything's working out for your good, then today just start with holding on to Jesus. Follow Him. And you will know that He's working everything out for your good. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the opportunity that you've made available for each and every one of us to call on Jesus. To know that we are loved. To know that we are cared for. To know that you're working out our life. Lord, today I ask that for those that will surrender, that you'll show them extraordinary measures that you will go to show your love. Lord, break whatever's being held. Let your love shine through. Lord, allow us to let go of what life shows us and instead replace it with what you show us. Lord, as we gain your vision for our life, for the life of the people around us, we ask that you would grant us courage to do what you call us to do in the coming days. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.